The Nintendo Entertainment System was the boxier, more monotone version of the Family Computer that was released to the Western Hemisphere. Oh, and Australia too. Released in 1985, the original deluxe set came with the console, 2 controllers, Rob the robotic operating buddy, the NES Zapper, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt. With 2 years head start in Japan, the NES came overseas with a whopping 17 launch titles. 10-Yard Fight, Baseball, Clue Clue Land, Duck Hunt, Excite Bike, Golf, Gyromite, Hogan's Alley, Ice Climber, Kung Fu, Pinball, Soccer, Stack Up, Tennis, Wild Gunman, Wrecking Crew, and Super Mario Bros. Which admittedly isn't alphabetically listed like the others, but come on, it's the best of the bunch. On the front are the power and reset buttons, and a power light. Nice upgrade, Nintendo. Controller ports for 2 detachable controllers, in contrast to the Famicom's hardwired controllers that came out the back of the console. While the back of the NES didn't have controller ports, it did have an RF out, a channel 3 or channel 4 selector, and an AC adapter input, which literally takes in AC power. Very important to remember. On the US NTSC band, the RF adapter had to be tuned to channels 3 and 4, partly due to channel 1 being reserved for government use, and channel 2 is usually PBS or something. On the side are the RCA video and mono audio jacks, a feature not matched in Japan until later Famicom models, the Twin Famicom, and AV Famicom, which had a Super NES and Super Famicom style multi-out. The NES has an expansion port on the bottom, which was designed with the sound expansion features of Famicom cartridges in mind, but unfortunately went unused during the NES's lifetime. By comparison, the Famicom's extension port was mostly used with controller peripherals, such as the light gun and Family Trainer. On the NES, this port was actually routed through the Player 2 controller port, which is why peripherals like the NES Zapper and Power Pad don't function on the Player 1 controller port. While many of the Famicom's extension port peripherals were also developed for the NES, many others were not. Still, the NES had a number of its own unique gadgets. The NES Advantage and NES Max controllers, and drastically altered multiplayer adapters in the forms of the NES Satellite and Fourscore. Speaking of controllers, although the size and layout of the controllers are nearly identical, with the patented directional pad and concave A and B buttons, the NES got something of a facelift, plus a few enhancements. The NES controller attaches to the top instead of the side, although the Famicom controller has more rounded edges, so comfort is in the hands of the holder. The cables on the NES were also quite a bit longer, coming in at over 7 feet versus 18 inches for the Famicom, 5 times as long. But what Nintendo giveth, it also taketh away. The NES has no dedicated Player 2 controller. The microphone and volume slider are gone. Instead, it's identical to the Player 1 controller. This is one reason why many early generation games didn't utilize the Player 2 start and select buttons at all. Unlike the multicolored publisher customized cartridges of the Family Computer, NES cartridges were only manufactured by Nintendo, and created in the standard size, color, and configuration. Well, externally anyway. NES cartridges were originally released in a 5-screw variety that can be opened with a small flathead screwdriver. While third parties printed new boards specific to the NES, some early Nintendo published games contained the original Famicom cartridge inside in order to reduce costs and meet demand in the first few years of the console's life. Because of differences in the cartridge pin outputs, and the need to house a 10 NES lockout chip, a converter cartridge was required to make these Famicom games playable on an NES. This also explains why some games, such as Gyromite, had their title screens unchanged from the Japanese versions. Similarly, Nintendo-published games originally released for the Famicom Disk System all used the same board on the NES, reserving a spot for the battery backup to be used when the technology was cost-effective enough to include. Eventually, Nintendo settled on the 3-screw variation, with 2 tabs at the top, much like Famicom cartridges, and all with far less interesting contents. Except the games themselves, of course. The uniform size and shape of NES cartridges had less to do with these internals than the next big feature difference, the infamous zero insertion force slot. Nintendo decided that the VCR-style slot would be a definite feature of the updated Famicom hardware, and designed the toaster shell around it. This design required a set of springy pins that unfortunately can get dirty, erode, or just become less springy over time, causing communication problems with the 10NES chip, leading to the fabled red blinking light. Just don't blow it.
No!
The Famicom didn't have any form of blackout chip, so even if it had a power light, like on the Turbo Twin Famicom, it would never blink. The NES's chip was created to address piracy concerns and unauthorized cartridges, but also to enforce Nintendo's strict licensing agreements. Of course, this didn't stop some companies from making unlicensed third-party games, but that is another story entirely.
What?
Famicom Dojo.
The Family Computer was Nintendo's first self-manufactured, fully featured home console. Known as the Famicom for short, the system was released in Japan on July 15, 1983. It's a top-loading cartridge-based system with a plastic flap that acts as a dust cover to protect the contacts.